Another really handy feature in Logic is the drum replacement tool, and it's quite common now in modern production to actually add in samples like snare samples, kick samples to beef up and make your snares and your drums sound better. It's not as common with other instruments, but with drums and percussion it's very, very common, and you can even replace the drums, and I'm going to show you both ways. A lot of the time you just double it up so that you have a snare sample that sits just underneath your live snare that adds either more crack or more body, or just a slightly different sound. And then the dynamics come from the real snare, so it doesn't sound like the same snare is triggering every time, because you get the dynamics from the overheads and the real snare. So let's have a look at that. First of all, let's look at completely replacing it. So I seem to have lost my snare top. So there's our snare up. So let's go to track and replace or double drum track. And you can do Alt D. First of all, what we're going to do is actually replace it. So we're going to hit replacement. And then what we're going to do now is have a listen to these snares. So once you've found a snare that you like by sampling through these, just leave that selected. I quite like this one, it's got a lot of crack to it. Great, and now what we're going to do is in this window here, we're going to adjust some of these options. Now, the most important option you have here is the relative threshold, and this dictates at what point it counts the hits on here and the transients on here as a snare hit. So when it's really high, 0 dB, none of our snares are hitting hard enough to trigger that. When it's really low, every little sound, so the bleed from the kick and probably the toms and the hi-hat, are being kind of measured as a snare hit. So what we want to do instead is tune it so it's only on these big hits and some of these kind of ghost hits here as well. So now we can see that all these big hits, yep, there's a MIDI marker on each of them, and then these little ghost hits, there's also a MIDI marker there. So let's have a listen. So you can hear those ones are quite a bit quieter. So just make sure that they're being triggered as well, because if not, you'll only get the loudest ones, which can be fine. Sometimes you might want that. You might just want to add a sample on the loudest snares and not the ghost notes, but I'm going to do the ghost notes too. Trigger note, we're just going to leave to auto, and time and offset also at 0. And then we hit OK. And what you'll notice now is that it's muted the original track because we hit replacement, and it's added a new track with the EXS24 sampler. It's loaded up the sample that we wanted. If we have a look at that, you can see our sample here. So I'm not sure where it's probably around there somewhere. So now we can have a listen to that on its own. And obviously it sounds quite repetitive because it's the same velocity every time. But then when we add it in underneath the overheads, because what we're actually doing now is replacing the snare. So let's mute the bottom snare as well. Because we're getting some snare from the overhead, it doesn't sound too fake. Just add in a lot of presence. Let's just turn that hi-hat down, that's quite annoying. Let's do that. Just give these a quick mix, bring down the overheads, and then let's bring up the snare. Let's add some gain on here, just make it louder. Overhead should be in stereo. So that's without the snare, and then we bring it back in. And then of course you can EQ it to taste. Let's bring this back down. We might want a bit less crack. Something like that. So that's one way, that's replacement, and that's really good if you've recorded in a really bad room, for example, and you want to replace most of the close mics. You want to replace the snare, and then of course we could also replace the kick, and just have the overheads up for dynamics, but have them quite low. And then what you can do is just go into this and play with the velocity a bit if you want to. So we could actually select some of these and adjust the velocity, like so. So you could go through, and when you're replacing all of the drums, that's a good practice. You need to spend a lot of time being very meticulous, trying to make it sound as human as possible. Of course, because it's MIDI, we can also quantize it, but then it's going to be perfectly on the beat, which might sound a bit too inhuman, but there we go. Now, if we want to just tuck it in underneath, in the original settings, we could have said doubling rather than replacement. But all it's done is just turned off our original, so we can turn that back on. And now what we can do is balance the natural snares. We've got a snare top and a snare bottom, and then just bring this one in for a bit more crack or a bit more body, whatever kind of sample you went for. So let's listen with the original snare. And then we can bring this in to add a different character. Of course, that's going to increase the volume, so then you have to balance all of these. And of course, we might want to add a different characteristic of sound. So if you want to change the sample, we can just click this little arrow here, and that'll take us to the library with the samples. And then we could try something slightly different. So we could either use a whole snare, or these ones, layer snares, are made for this purpose exactly. So if we want to add more body or more transient, we can do that. Let's test some of these. So they're sometimes good when you're creating your own snare and you do want to layer lots and lots of samples. But I think I actually prefer just layering normal acoustic snares. So now let's try that. Of course, what we can also do is, instead of using the EXS4 sampler, we could just use a different kit or snare altogether. So we could go to drum kit, and then we can pick one of the drummer kits, and it will automatically use the snare from that. So let's try SoCal. Let's have a listen to that. And then we could try something a bit heavier. So that's a really important part of modern production, especially if you're working in a home studio. Using samples can really help to add more attack, more body, or a kind of more professional sound to your snares and your kicks and your toms. A lot of the time, toms don't necessarily need it. The most common way to replace drums is just the kick and the snare, but that can make a huge difference to your mix. And that feature there makes it just so easy that there's no excuse not to, really.